Welcome to the online classroom for the module INV4801. In this class, I'm going to be taking you through assignment 1 for the module INV4801, the 2021 assignment number 1. Okay. As with most assignments in this module, an assignment can touch on a number of sections or a number of topics. So you can't really say that a question is based on one particular area of the module. So in the exam or in assignments, you have to be prepared to answer some questions which can touch on a number of areas. For example, an assignment might touch on your prior knowledge on finance and investments. It can also touch on knowledge from the coursework. So, and it can even touch on knowledge from other modules which are part of the honors modules. So when you're dealing with questions and assignments and in exams for INV 4801, FIN 4800 especially, and also FIN 4802 to a lesser degree, 4802, it's possible that sometimes there might be some areas that overlap, but not too much. For example, you'll see that this assignment touches on the weighted average cost of capital. But if you look at your prescribed book and your prescribed material, there is no particular chapter that focuses on the weighted average cost of capital. This is assumed to be prior knowledge, and it's also examined and taught in the module FIN 4801. So these modules overlap, so you need to be prepared for that. Even issues to do with internal rate of return, there really isn't a chapter on that in INV 4801. It's all assumed to be prior knowledge, okay? And it's also knowledge related to other honors modules. And it's also not directly in the coursework for the module. So you just need to be prepared for that. You shouldn't be narrow-minded when it comes to some of these questions. Okay, so we're going to go through this assignment. We'll start with question number 1. As usual, when you're going through these questions, it's always important to read the question carefully before you attempt it. So I'll read this question and then we'll go through my solutions and we'll be discussing. It's a 25-mark question. It says, Ruseri Investments is a RSA-based chain of department stores with operating assets of 1 billion in market value terms. Ruseri Investments sponsors a defined benefit pension plan. I'm sure we know what a defined benefit pension plan is now. We pull all the money of employees into one pot and then we invest that money, and then us as a company agree to pay certain defined benefits calculated based on certain formulas to the employees when they retire. So Ruseri Investment sponsors a defined benefit pension plan that invests exclusively in domestic equities and domestic investment grade corporate bonds. Okay, so this pension plan only invests in domestic shares and in domestic investment grade bonds. Okay. Selected Ruseri Investments and Pension Plan financial data are shown in Exhibit 1. So please note what's happening here. employees, right? Employees are paid salaries, right? And then a percentage of these salaries, are set aside, like they are put into a pension plan. A percentage of these salaries are put into a pension plan. So once money has been put into this pension plan, all the money that's put into this pension plan is then invested in equities, which are shares and also bonds. So that's what we are being told in this question. Okay. The employees of Reseri Investments get paid salaries. And then a percentage of these salaries are put aside into a pension plan or a pension pot, right? And then those salaries, as they accumulate and they are put in there, the pension fund invests those into equities and bonds, right? So what will happen when individuals retire and they start receiving payments? Some of the equities or bonds will be sold, or they might be paying coupon payments or dividends. So these coupon payments and dividends will then be passed on to these employees once they retire. So that's the whole idea behind a defined benefit pension plan. Make sure you know the difference between a defined benefit pension plan, where all the money of all the employees is pooled into one pot and then invested. Make sure you know the difference between a defined benefit pension plan and a defined contribution pension plan. A defined contribution pension plan. With a defined contribution pension plan, each employee will have their own pot of money, and each employee will have their own money invested in certain investments that suit them. And then on retirement payments to a particular employee will be paid out of their particular pension pot or pension investment. With defined benefit, all the money is pulled together and it's the employer who agrees to pay benefits to employees, which are defined, calculated based on a certain formula. So with a defined benefit pension plan, the risk is with the employer because the employer is the one who agrees to pay the benefits. Whereas with a defined contribution plan, each employee contributes a certain amount that they define into their own particular pots, and then their pension comes from their own particular pots. So here, the risk is with the employee because their money is segregated. If they don't save up enough money or investments don't perform as anticipated, the risk falls on the particular employee because their money is separated from the money of other employees. Whereas in a defined benefit pension plan, all the money is put into one pot and then the employer has the risk of paying out benefits. So here, we just need to understand the information we've been given. We've been given the investments of Reseri, this chain of department stores. We've been told that the chain of department stores has a debt to equity ratio of 0.6. Please note a debt to equity ratio, right? A debt to equity ratio is not the same as a debt ratio. Is not the same as a debt ratio. That's important. A debt to equity ratio is not the same as a debt ratio. Okay. A debt ratio is simply total liabilities. It's simply total liabilities over total assets. That's a debt ratio. Whereas a debt to equity ratio, debt to equity ratio is actually total liabilities or total debt, total liabilities over total equity. Okay, so please note the difference. The debt ratio is divided by total assets. The debt to equity ratio is divided by total equity. Okay, so that's important. And then we're also given the operating assets. They are 1 billion rands. The equity beta is 1.9 and the debt beta is 0. Remember, beta is a measure of how sensitive the returns on an asset are compared to returns on the market. So an equity beta of 1.9 means that the equity associated with Rusera investments, the equity is 1.9 times more risky than an average market portfolio. It's more risky than the market or an average market portfolio. Meaning if the market goes up by 1%, the equity associated with Rusera investments will go up by 1% times 1.9, which is 1.9%. So if the market goes up by 1%, the equity associated with Rusera investments will go up by 1.9%. And if the market goes down by 1%, the equity associated with Rusera investments will go down by 1.9%. So it's more sensitive than the market when the beta is higher than 1. Okay. And then we're also given information on the pension plan. We're given the equity portfolio beta, which is 1.4. So the equities they've invested in their pension plan have a beta of 1.4. The debt investments beta is 0. The market value of the pension plan is 700 million rands. The equity allocation is 60, and the surplus is 0. Also important, with the pension plan, we have what we call a surplus or a deficit, right? So these are just important terms for you to know as an investment student. When we have a surplus, it means the market value of our assets is more than the market value of the liabilities associated with the pension fund. So what will happen with the pension fund? And then when we have a deficit, actually, I think the best way to look at this is to do this, okay? We can calculate a surplus, right? So we can calculate a surplus by saying the market value of assets minus the market value of liabilities. This is how we can calculate a surplus, right? If the surplus is, if the answer we get here is positive, we call it a surplus, right? And if the answer we get here is negative, we call it a deficit, okay? If the difference between the market value of the assets minus the market value of the liabilities, if it's positive, we say we have a surplus. And if it's negative, we say we have a deficit, okay? So where does that come from exactly, those definitions about a surplus and a deficit? So this is the idea. It's just good for you to understand this because you can get some theory questions in the exam and you need to be able to explain them, right? So if you have a pension fund, right, the pension fund will invest in assets. Remember, we were told that the assets that this pension fund is invested in consists of equity and consists of bonds, right? Those are the assets. And at the same time, the pension fund will have liabilities. And the liabilities that the pension fund has are the payments they have to make to employees when they retire. Payments to employees when they retire. So what will happen? A pension fund will calculate the present value of the payments they have to make to employees when they retire. They'll calculate the present value of all these liabilities. They'll calculate the present value of the payments they have to make to employees when they retire. And they'll also calculate or obtain the market value of assets. So this is what will usually happen. And then when we subtract these two, the answer we get is either a surplus or a deficit. If the answer is positive, it means we have a surplus. It means the company has more assets compared to liability. So they should be able to meet all the obligations they owe on the pension as they fall due. However, if we get a negative answer, it means we have a deficit. It means that the assets that we have are currently insufficient to meet the liabilities. Okay, so that's what we mean by a deficit and a surplus in the context of pensions, right? So now let's get to the actual question we're being asked. We're told Rusere Investments hires Rule Tavongaishe to study the implications of the asset allocation of the pension plan's investment portfolio on Rusere Investments' financial and operating characteristics. Tavongaishe notes that a defined benefit pension plan's asset and liabilities can directly affect the sponsoring company's equity price, the equity price volatility, and the amount of operational risk the company is able to assume. Okay. The nominal risk-free rate is 7.7%. The market rate is 10%. Tavongaishe's preliminary analysis does not take the effects of taxes into consideration. Rusere Investments bases its capital budgeting decisions on the internal rate of return and accepts capital projects with IRR greater than Rusere's investments weighted average cost of capital. Rusere Investment does not include the pension plan's assets and liabilities when calculating its WACC. And then part A, we're told to calculate and interpret Rusere Investment's total beta, excluding the pension plan's assets and liabilities. B, calculate Rusere Investment's WACC, excluding the pension plan's assets and liabilities. Part C, calculate Rusere Investments WACC, including the pension plan's assets and liabilities. And then discuss why Rusere Investments equity beta increases in response to the pension plan's change in asset allocation after given a small case study here. Okay. Right. Okay, now the first thing we need to do when we want to determine the investment's total beta, excluding the pension assets and liabilities, it means we're just focusing on the investments. We first need to calculate and to determine the weight of debt, right? We need to determine the weight of debt in our assets, how much of our assets are invested in debt, and we also need to determine the weight of equity, right? So we've got some investments as a company. Some of our investments are in debt, some of our investments are in equity. So we need to determine what percentage of our investments are in debt and what percentage of our investments are in equity. And then after doing that, we can then determine the weighted beta. We can then determine the weighted beta, which will be the beta of the investments that Rusere has invested in. Okay, so I'll show you how to do that. So to determine the weight of debt and the corresponding weight of equity, we can use the debt to equity ratio. We can use the debt to equity ratio. We can use the debt to equity ratio. And there's a formula that says if you want to get the weight of debt, which is also known as the debt ratio, if you want to get the weight of debt, which is also known as the debt ratio, from the debt to equity ratio, you simply take your debt to equity over 1 plus your debt to equity. So this is the formula you use if you want to get the debt ratio or the weight of debt in your capital structure, or with or depending on your investment. So in this case, we take the debt to equity ratio over 1 plus the debt to equity ratio. So this will be 0.6 divided by 1 plus 0.6, which gives us 0.375. And then the weight of equity will be 1 minus the weight of debt, which gives us 0.625. Now, in some questions that I've seen in some past papers or in some assignments, sometimes they can just give you the debt ratio direct. If they give you the debt ratio direct, there's no need for you to do this calculation. We just did this calculation because we were given the debt to equity ratio. And if we want to get the weight of debt or the debt ratio when we've been given the debt to equity ratio, we take the debt to equity ratio over 1 plus the debt to equity ratio. So that's an important formula. It also overlaps a bit with INV4801. And then once we've determined the percentage of our funds which are invested in investment grade corporate bonds and the percentage of our funds which are invested in equity, right? Let's actually see, is that what they said about the investable assets? Let me just confirm. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. It's a chain of department stores, sponsors a defined benefit. Okay, this is the defined benefit pension plan. Okay. Here we're still looking at the capital structure. We're still looking at the capital structure here. We're still looking at the capital structure. Remember, with our capital structure, we have debt and we have equity on one side of the balance sheet, and then we have assets on the other side. So we've just calculated the percentage of debt in our capital structure, and we've also calculated the percentage of equity in our capital structure, right? So these assets that we have, these operating assets, the operating assets will include things like inventory, buildings, vehicles. It will include all the assets that the company is using in its operations. And these assets are being financed by debt, and they're also being financed by equity. So in this question, we have been asked to determine and interpret the company's total beta, excluding the pensions, plans, and assets. In other words, we're trying to calculate the beta associated with the company, excluding the assets and liabilities associated with the pension plan. So once we've determined the weight of debt and the weight of equity, we can simply get the weighted beta of these sources of finance that we have. And to get the weighted beta, we can take the weight of debt times the beta of debt plus the weight of equity times the beta of equity. So it's simply a case of substituting in. Remember, we've been told that our debt has a beta of 0, our equity has a beta of 1.9. If we do this calculation, we get 1.1875. So that's the weighted beta associated with the debt and the equity associated with the sources of finance, right? And then we're told to calculate and interpret Rosetta Investments' total beta, excluding the pension plans, assets, and liabilities. So here, it's important to note that there are different ways to interpret this. I've written one interpretation here, but you can interpret this in different ways. So I said the beta of the investments assets is more than 1. So this means the assets are 1.19 times more volatile or more risky than the market. Okay. So in other words, if we look at this company, Rosetta investments, because the beta associated with the sources of finance which are used to finance the assets, because the beta is more than 1, this means the assets are 1.9 times more risky or volatile than the market. Okay, if we just consider equity, it's 1.9, but if we calculate the weighted beta associated with the whole company, right? We can say that, in fact, we can also just say that the company, I think it would be better to say that this means that the company returns are 1.1 times more risky or volatile than the market. I think I'll actually change that wording to say that the beta of the investment assets is more than 1. This means that the company's returns are 1.19 times more risky than the market. Remember, beta is a measure of how sensitive the returns on a particular investment are compared to the market, right? And then we're told to calculate Rosetta investments WACC, excluding the pension assets and liabilities. So to calculate the weighted average cost of capital, for this case, we can just use the capital asset pricing model by simply taking the risk-free rate plus 1.1875, which is the beta, times the return on the market minus the risk-free rate. So this is the beta right here. Here I just wrote it without rounding off. And we get 10.43%. Please be careful with this calculation. Just enter everything into your calculator. Be careful of board mass, but you should get 10.43%. So these two the calculation for the WACC, we could have done it in a different way. We could have simply calculated the cost of debt using the capital asset pricing model, where we say the risk-free rate plus the beta times the return on the market minus the risk-free rate, we get 7.7%. And we could have calculated the cost of equity by itself using the capital asset pricing model to give us 12.07. And then we could have just calculated the WACC by saying the weight of debt times cost of debt plus the weight of equity times cost of equity. So we would get the same answers. I would prefer the first approach that I use, but the alternative approach would also get you the same answer. It was just for illustration to show you how else you can calculate the weighted average cost of capital in this question. Okay, now let's look at Part C. Part C says, calculate Rosetta investments WACC, including the pension plans, assets, and liabilities. Okay. Now, for this part of the question, we need to factor in some other concepts. Remember, we said that the company has equity and it has liabilities, right? On one side of its balance sheet, of its statement of financial position. And then on the other side, the company has its assets, right? This is how we framed it. Now, so this is just Rosetta investments, excluding the pension plan. But now we want to factor in the pension plan. And the pension plan has liabilities associated with it, right? And the pension plan also has assets associated with it. So before we just calculated the WACC for Rosetta investments by just looking at the equity and the liabilities associated directly with Rosetta investments, as well as the corresponding assets which were purchased using the equity and the liabilities, right? Now we want to include this in analysis to factor in the liabilities and the assets associated with the pension plan. So what we did before, we calculated the WACC that was associated with the equity and the liabilities, and we attributed that WACC to the returns on the assets, and then we used that to get the WACC. Okay. But now what we want to do, we now want to, okay, we now want to calculate the WACC associated with the equity and the liabilities of Reseri Investments and the liabilities of the pension plan. We now want to calculate the WACC of all these. We now want to calculate the beta associated with the equity for Reseri Investments, its liabilities, as well as the liabilities of the pension plan, right? And then we're going to use that beta. To help us to calculate the WACC of both of these assets combined. Okay. Right. So how are we going to go about doing that? We need to take the weight of equity, which is here from these investments, times the beta of that equity, plus the weight of liabilities or the weight of debt here, times the cost of debt for Reseri Investments, plus the weight of these liabilities associated with the pension plan, times, sorry, this should actually be the beta. So it's going to be the weight of the equity times the beta associated with the equity for Reseri Investments, plus the weight for the debt times the beta associated with the debt for Reseri Investments, plus the weight of the liabilities in the pension plan, times the beta associated with the liabilities in the pension plan. Okay. So let's go back to our information to actually see where